Hello and welcome to the IR Thinker, where we explore the world of international relations one critical issue at a time. I'm Martin Zupko. This episode explores African agency in global climate governance, moving beyond narratives that portrayed African states solely as vulnerable recipients of climate policy. Drawing on debates in international relations, environmental politics, and African climate futures, the conversations examines how African actors negotiate, contest, and reimagine climate governance across local, continental, and global arenas. Through discussions of energy transition, environmental justice, and African futures, climate fictions, the episode considers how new political imaginaries are reshaping understandings of climate politics in Africa and beyond. My guest today is Dr. Carl Dev. Hello?
Hello, thanks very much for having me.
Carl Dev is a senior lecturer in international political economy at the University of Manchester. His research focuses on environmental politics in Africa, with particular interest in critical and post-colonial approaches. And it was Dr. Dev's latest book, African Climate Futures, that inspired me to develop this episode. It's a part of the Oxford Studies in African Politics and International Relations series. That book draws on African futurist climate fiction to challenge and enrich theoretical debates in global climate politics, particularly the ways we understand the places, the temporalities, ecologies, and politics shaping climate futures. And what's interesting it is that in the center of the book is that original interdisciplinary approach that analyzes official climate policy, strategies, alongside fictional texts as ecopolitical imaginaries. So that's an innovative concept that I would like to highlight during the discussion. Let's start with the first question. I think much of the global climate governance literature portrays African states primarily as recipients of climate finance, aid, some adaptation policies. How should we conceptualize African agency within international climate politics to avoid those stereotypes?
Thanks, Martin, and thanks very much for that introduction and the invitation. It's lovely to talk to you today. And I think that's a really good question to start off with, because you're absolutely right. I think the dominant narrative or framing of Africa, African states, African people, African societies, Africa as an idea within global politics, and certainly within global politics, often tends to reinforce this status of marginality, of passivity, of vulnerability. At its most extreme, it's the Africa as victim type narrative. And you see this in mainstream IR debates on climate governance and international governance, which often realist and liberal approaches tend to focus on great powers and major powers and African states in general, although there's obviously great diversity there that we can talk about, often seem to lack the power to set the agenda of international politics and tend to be framed more as being acted upon. You also see this in some critical framings as well. I mean, there are some versions of a kind of neo-colonial analysis in which Africa is part of the periphery that is exploited by and dominated by the great powers of world politics and external powers. And I think the climate governance and climate politics is one of the most vivid examples of this, because so often the discussion here starts from the observation that Africa as a continent is continent least responsible for climate change, the lowest historic greenhouse gas emissions, and even in the present day, most countries are well below average greenhouse gas emissions, and yet is also one of the continents most affected by climate change. And so many African states, again, it's different in different places, but many African states have been having to cope with the effects of climate change, adapt to climate change for decades now, and in some cases have some of the least capacity to adapt sustainably and prosperously for their populations. Now, all of this is absolutely true. There's a reason why we often start the debate here. It is true, and it's possible to make this point from a position that also recognizes African agency and narrates or frames the contributions of African politicians and states and societies and communities within this position of structural disadvantage. But it does also lend itself to a framing in which, Africa is the victim. This is the kind of the narrative in which, without our help, Africa is doomed. Which lends itself to at its worst, the kind of white saviorism or a framing in which Africa needs to be helped modernizing in order to replicate the successes, supposedly, of European modernization and development. And this is one of the a really prominent way in which Africa tends to be framed in global politics, and it's one that I discuss a lot with my students when I'm teaching. But in my work, I've always been drawn, I think, to examples and cases that allow us to explore forms of African agency and resistance within this unequal global structure. But there are just, in my own work, I've looked at environmental activism, so communities or social movements or NGOs campaigning against nuclear power in South Africa, or environmental justice movements. There are lots of interesting examples of where state level governments and political parties or communities at the subnational level have made really interesting contributions in terms of environmental governance, attempts to decolonize conservation. And I think once we start taking a broader, more nuanced perspective on power and agency, that encompasses things like soft power and the power of ideas and the power of norms, and the way in which diverse, multi-scalar, polyvalent forms of political agency at all sorts of levels can contribute to and engage with and reshape global governance. I think you end up getting a richer picture of the role of diverse African political communities in global politics. And we can think of all sorts of examples of this. I mean, Morocco is building one of the world's largest solar power plants and plans to export electricity to Europe. There are South Africa is one of the world's most coal-dependent economies, and yet there's a really seismic revolution in renewable energy happening in South Africa at the moment, and predictions that 50% of South African electricity could be generated by wind and solar within the next 10 years. There's over the last 10, 15 years of global climate governance, you've had the African Union articulating an African common position on climate change, which we could talk more about in the discussion today. That hasn't always been easy, but I think that has had a big impact on global climate governance. Many African states have some of the largest conservation areas in the world are in Africa. So countries like Tanzania and Botswana and Zambia and Namibia have over 30% of their land devoted to protected areas. And it's a brief plug, in one of my previous books, The Green State in Africa, I actually started that book with a quote from a well-known Africanist historian, John Iliffe, who argues that one of the central themes of African history is the peopling of the continent, the achievement of human coexistence with nature, and the building up of enduring societies in often quite challenging environmental conditions. So I think there's a huge amount that global politics and global environmental politics can learn from how African societies have in some cases learned to live alongside on non-human and more than human environments.
As a scholar, was there any impulse that changed your view on African agency during your research, maybe studying as a student before? Because as I highlighted at the beginning, that book that you wrote has a perspective coming from slightly different angle than the mainstream books on Africa. And I really appreciate that perspective. But it's not easy to get into it. You must have some impulse, something that is prompting you to go and research deeper, to travel, to meet with people, speak with people, and speak about their policies, their dreams. not imposing what you know or what you studied from your university. So, was there any major milestone that you decided, I can't be just writing mainstream books, publishing every second year or some or stuff like that, but I really want to, go into it and try to contribute to academic research by innovative solution, innovative thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, my interest in Africa and African politics, I mean, part of it is biographical, as you say, through travel, and part of it, I mean, the first engagement I had with African politics and academically was I was an undergrad studying history, and I became really interested in and inspired by the history and politics of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. That was my first kind of engagement with African politics and African history. And then I took that, I think that inspired my transition from history into politics in terms of a discipline, and traveling in South Africa and in the late 90s and early 2000s, and seeing that society in an incredibly dramatic, concentrated transition from one of the worst examples of a racist colonial state to a society which was certainly internationally was being framed as the Rainbow Nation, the miracle transition, Mandela as this kind of sainted figure internationally. It was a really inspiring time to be studying and talking to people about politics. And I mean, in some respect, that's why I study politics and certainly African politics, in that at that time, and things might be somewhat different now. We could talk about that. In people in South Africa seem to have a belief that politics could change things from the better. That politics, democracy, elections, parties were one way in which to transform the violences and injustices of the past. And so I mean, that is, I learned a huge amount from these amazing, inspiring activists and intellectuals and academics. Many academics in South Africa are also themselves deeply involved in community or national politics. It's quite hard to stay outside the sort of cut and thrust of politics in somewhere like South Africa, and so that was quite inspiring as well. And I suppose you can draw a continuity between that to my most recent book, which looks at not just political strategies and policy strategies, but also fiction, and the role of writing, both fictional writing and academic writing, as a form of engagement in politics and a desire to take African voices and perspectives seriously.
One of the issues in global climate governance, especially frameworks, is universal policy models, or are universal policy models. Basically, you have those consultants, academics coming to different countries and bringing something they know that works. But it works in different parts of the world because of that universal model. And they think it's, if it works in America or Europe or Asia, it should work in Africa as well. How is this received by African states and academics or public?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, global governance is characterized, isn't it, by these top-down frameworks, whether we're talking about the Millennium Development Goals or the Sustainable Development Goals, or the UNFCCC, UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, policies on climate governance. And it's a really crucial, I mean, it's an obvious point to make early on, but when we're talking about African climate politics, Africa is a really, really big continent, and there's huge diversity across 55 different countries and 1.5 billion people, and different societies and histories and very different ecologies and environments as well. And there is no kind of single policy framework that can apply everywhere. I mean, even within countries. South Africa is often described as the world in a country, and there's in just between rural and urban areas, between from west coast to east coast, up in the mountains and out in the desert, the ecological and political and social conditions are very pronounced. Now, of course, this is also true everywhere else in the world. Where in the world isn't like this? I think it relates to your earlier question about the degree to which there's a perception and a reality as well. I think that African states have been less able to shape and define these universal policy frameworks, and they tend to be more framed as recipients of them. And this is a problematic and a tension, and many African policymakers and activists and intellectuals are well aware that there is a real tendency for these kind of universal policy frameworks to reproduce a colonial logic in which Africa is either not fully considered, or African interests are not priorities. On the other hand, I think there is also, I mean, I use those two examples of the Sustainable Development Goals and climate governance under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, because I think we've seen a big shift in the last 10 to 15 years. In both those frameworks, there has been a move towards nationally determined targets and strategies. So the Sustainable Development Goals set out these global goals, but then it's explicitly up to countries in terms of how they want to deliver on these. And the same under the Paris Agreement from 2015. There's been a move away from a top-down model of a focus on internationally negotiating common but differentiated responsibilities to this nationally determined targets and strategies for meeting them. And I think in some respects there are many African climate justice activists who would argue that the international community should be doing more to encourage and pressure governments to live up to their commitments and live up to universally agreed and negotiated norms and commitments, because there are lots of examples we can think of from all around the world where governments have managed to use the flexibility of these nationally determined targets in order to kind of sidestep some of the trickier obligations in terms of responding to climate change.
When we research international dimension of the global climate governments, we have United Nations, we have many multilateral forums. And my question would be, how do you see a movement of Pan-Africanism and that idea of uniting Africa to have one African voice internationally? But on the other hand, we see how many fractions are in Africa. One country is doing this, the second is doing that. Some countries, they even don't speak with each other. So there's a concept that it's nice theoretically, but there are some issues in reality. But based on your research, what's the coordination status at the moment when you research African states and their coordination in the global climate governments?
That's a great question, and I mean, it's empirically fascinating. I've worked a bit in the past on Pan-Africanist negotiation within the climate process. It's also a really interesting theoretical question or conceptual question as to what we mean by Africa. And Africa is both a geographical concept, a kind of geographical fiction imposed on again, very large numbers of people in 55 different countries with huge diversity across them. But Africa is also a political project, as you say. There is an assertion of Pan-Africanness and the need for Africans' solidarity and a unified African voice, in part as a response to the colonial partitioning of the continent through the division of Africa into nation states or state nations, which often didn't reflect pre-existing social and linguistic groups, and which have been largely unchanged despite the anti-colonial and decolonial movement. And then there's also the way in which Africa is a kind of an idea or a discourse or a framing, a concept in global political culture and thought as well for all sorts of ways. But in more sort of concrete empirical terms, I think it's really interesting that process of how the African Union and other forms of Pan-African attempts to build a consensus have worked in climate policy. And uh, for over 20 years now, African states have been trying to achieve a unified voice on climate change, and the so-called African Common Position on climate change has been around for 20 years now, and it hasn't always been easy, precisely for the reasons you mentioned. There are big tensions between some of the major powers on the continent and very different climate challenges and economic and energy challenges that different countries are facing. But it's still that is still a position that has had a big impact at various key moments in the in climate governance. For example, in the Copenhagen Climate Summit in 2010, which is a long time ago now, but it was a particularly interesting moment at which it seemed like it was all going to fall apart without an agreement. And then at the last minute, there was a closed door negotiation with Obama bringing together this key group of states, Brazil, India, China, and South Africa behind closed doors to kind of rescue the conference and produce an agreed text. And this was a moment at which it seemed like the African common position could fracture, because South Africa, which had been one of the loudest voices on climate change and very proactive on climate change, was supporting the consensus, the Copenhagen text behind closed doors, whereas outside, Lumumba Diapeng, who was the chair, a Sudanese diplomat and chair of the G77 at the time, very controversially stood up and said, you can't ask Africa to sign this text. It's a suicide pact. It will condemn us to incineration. And particularly objecting to the dropping of the 1.5 degree target and moving to a 2-degree target. And I mean, whilst that was a very intense and damaging experience at which African commonality, consensus and solidarity seemed to fall apart, it played such a significant role in the negotiations, such that 5 years later, when you get to Paris, a lot of people were really surprised that the 1.5 degree target is back in, and that is, I think, largely a result of Africa, that not entirely due to African agency, but it is an example of how Africa had set some of the terms and some of had shaped the debates around targets, and also on things like the slow and difficult and certainly insufficient, but the negotiations around loss and damage. The idea that the international community has a responsibility to help countries repair and address some of the loss and damage caused by climate change already. I mean, that also surprised many people that was making it into the outcomes, and that was something that African countries had been pressing for quite strongly as well.
Just connect to your question. Do you see any leaders from Africa in this area regarding the climate global governance? You mentioned South Africa as one of the loudest voices in Africa, but as you said, there are 55 states. So based on your research, who do you consider as the main leaders in the climate change and also energy transition agendas?
Yeah, I mean, there's some of these I talk about in the latest in my latest book, which looked at some of the first long-term low carbon or net zero energy strategies to be submitted to the UNFCCC by African states. So South Africa was one of those. Other really significant ones were Ethiopia and Nigeria. Ethiopia under Meles Zenawi had been a really key negotiator and prominent voice on climate change, and the need to, in particular, adapt the challenges of adapting to climate change in the Horn of Africa and largely agricultural economy, but an economy that was also going through very fast rates of transformation and economic development. So Ethiopia has been quite proactive in terms of trying to forge a common position on climate change, and also recognizing the need to transition to new forms of energy and new development models, and putting in place a lot of policies around climate change. Nigeria was always regarded as a sort of, it used to be regarded as something of a laggard, not coal dependent like South Africa, but very, very oil and now gas dependent, OPEC member, and facing its own governance challenges, should we say. In the last 10, 15 years, I think that perspective on Nigeria has been challenged quite a bit. Nigeria is now trying to play the role of a leader on climate change, and at times in some forums talks the talk about the need to transition away from fossil fuels to a post-fossil fuel economy. That's very contested. Exactly what that means in the context of an economy like Nigeria that's so oil dependent is a really big question. And there is also this question about the extent to which these positive seeming strategies that exist on paper, the extent to which they mean anything or can be implemented, and to what degree they have broader societal buy-in, and do governments have the power to deliver on some of these strategies. But there are other examples as well. I mean, Kenya is making huge advances in renewable energy and geothermal energy, and then there's in the Congo Basin, the countries, Gambia and Gabon and DRC and so on, doing work on conservation and trying to protect one of the world's major carbon sinks, the forests in the Congo Basin. I mean, there are examples from all over the continent.
Let's speak about your book a little bit in order to understand the main ideas and your goals. You explore 15 African authors writing climate fiction. And I want to find the connection between the climate fiction and the climate change ongoing in Africa and on the world. So how should we understand your intention about climate fiction, African agency in climate change? And why that idea? What was the prompt that you used the fiction instead of, for instance, I don't know, academic books or some serious writings?
Thank you. Yeah, and I'd love to talk more about the book. And at times, as you've suggested a few times, it does seem a somewhat provocative or slightly unusual or radical position to turn to science fiction, fantasy texts. How can we learn about real world politics? And it seems somehow unserious, or doesn't the pressing urgency of the climate crisis require us to be more serious than this? So the book it aims to address questions like what do we think our climate changed future is going to be like? How can we imagine alternative climate futures? How do our imagination of alternative climate futures feed into policies and policy strategies around the energy transitions or low carbon futures? And what is the role of fiction in producing, reproducing, challenging, resisting dominant ways in which energy futures are imagined? And as you suggested, the key kind of methodological innovation or contribution of the book is to start by looking at net zero policy strategies, the serious politics. Though I have to say, in some cases, some of these policy strategies might be more akin to science fiction than some of the science fiction texts that I've been reading as well. But leaving that to the side for a moment, starting with some of these net zero policy strategies, and then asking, in a way, treating them as stories or narratives themselves, and asking, well, what sort of visions of the future do they envisage? What's the plot of how they envisage societies might get there? What sort of characters and actors, forms of agency, do they rely upon? And what are some of the things that are invisible or marginalized or not possible to discuss and frame within these policy strategies? And so then the second half of the book then turns to, as you said, 15 different authors of both short stories and novels, and a few films as well, within the broader genre of African climate fiction. So climate fiction that's written by African authors and is predominantly set somewhere in Africa, um, in order to really as a way of critiquing or to reading alongside the dominant political narratives about politics, and arguing that by reading this fiction and thinking about the sorts of societies it envisages, the sorts of places that are portrayed, the types of relations with non-human species, which is something that is almost completely absent from any of the policy texts and policy strategies, from thinking about how they narrate relationships and trajectories from past, present to future, which is something that's implicit in the policy strategies, but it's rarely discussed or unpicked. And the politics of them. I mean, what was really striking is that there is a certain style, as I'm sure you know from your own work, there is a certain style of writing policy strategies and policy documents that is really depoliticized. It's very technical. It's very often very reliant on quantitative sources. It's often written in quite an objective or neutral tone, and so there's very little. Actually, somewhat surprisingly, there's very little about the need for a more just system of global climate governance in these policy strategies. There's very little about loss and damage or reparations or uneven terms of trade or actually there was very little in most of them about the need for a just transition. Whereas when you turn to the climate fiction, you have revolutions in which the Western economic order is being overturned. You have revolutions and movements within states. You have gendered power relations within societies. I think fiction is one way of opening up some of the political issues that are absolutely central to an energy transition, but are sometimes seen as too difficult or uncomfortable or contentious to be talked about within the formal domain of policymaking, which is sort of ironic if you think about it.
Just a brief follow-up question. It's important when and who wrote those novels when you speak about Africa. Was there any framework or key according to which you selected those authors and novels? Because we know when something was written in 60s, 70s, and in 2025, there's going to be a big difference in ideas and how they portray their stories and dreams.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So what I would say at the start is that I'm not claiming that my little corpus that I've created or studied in this book is necessarily representative of African climate fiction more generally. It's not geographically representative. I selected these texts for theoretical and analytical reasons. These were the texts that helped me answer the research questions that I wanted to ask in this book in the most useful way. They were the texts that I found that resonated with me as stories in some way that supported the arguments that I wanted to make, and that I found most powerful and interesting and useful texts for critiquing the policy narrative. So I selected them in some ways in a similar way to how we select our theoretical texts and authors and perspectives. And indeed, there is a debate in the literature about the degree to which fiction can be thought of as a form of theory in itself. But to come back more directly to the question, it is a tricky subject. So firstly, of who counts as African in this, and the second issue is what counts as climate fiction as well. So in terms of who or which authors I considered African, or what the debates about how African these authors are. There's a range of authors that I look at. So one of the authors that I rely on or engage with most closely in the book is Nnedi Okorafor, who's a Nigerian American science fiction fantasy author. One of the writers in the Black Panther Marvel universe as well, quite popular in US fantasy and science fiction circles. Almost all of her stories are set in Nigeria or North Africa, in the Sahel or the Sahara. She explicitly invokes African literary and cultural heritage and traditions of writing, very much situated in that historical lineage, and yet she says she's never lived in Africa. She's born and brought up in the US. Other authors, I mean, there are other authors, a number of white South African authors, like Lauren Bucas or Alistair Mackay, who are African. They're born and brought up in South Africa, but South Africa's white English-speaking population has a slightly there are at least debates from many people elsewhere in the continent of the extent to which they can represent an African viewpoint. So there's also Doris Lessing is one of the authors I look at the book, who's born in Rhodesia as it was then, or grew up in Rhodesia, and had Rhodesia as one of the formative experiences in her writing career, but is a very famous white member of the British establishment, and is often described and was happy to be described as an African author, but didn't want to be defined in those terms, as well as lots of, in particular, short story writers from Nigeria, so people like Chinelo Onwualu, or Botswana, Toklo Semesi, and so this category of African author is an interesting, and there are interesting debates surrounding it. So I mainly chose authors who themselves position themselves within as contributing to, as I call it, African futurist perspectives on climate change. And the question of what counts as a climate change piece of fiction is also a tricky one. And some people have argued that all contemporary fiction is now about climate change. But I wanted to engage with stories that had climate and environmental themes as quite prominent, and engage with literature that had been published reasonably recently, so over the last 10 to 15 to 20 years, rather than some of that older literature.
Were all novels published in English, just for the audience if they want to read them?
Yes, absolutely. So all of the work I engage with is published in English, and we do discuss in the book how that also poses certain problems and issues in terms of the degree to which it can represent African climate imaginaries more generally. But for example, I think in every case, all of the short stories are free to read online. I explicitly engaged with some of the climate fiction novels that have been successful internationally, have not necessarily written for an international audience, but are accessible for an international audience as well.
In your research on African climate futures, you apply three theoretical strands: postcolonial, feminist, and queer perspectives. In the peer review process, people would be asking, like three perspectives, one book. So can you explain why three perspectives, and what's the connection to African Climate Agency?
Thanks. Yeah, and I think in all respects, these three approaches are what brings them together, as well as a shared critical theory, orientation, and tradition. Each of these perspectives draws attention to people and viewpoints that are often marginalized within dominant debates. These could be described as subjugated knowledges in Michel Foucault's terms, and drawing attention to and bringing some of these marginalized or silenced or subjugated perspectives and bringing them back to the center of debates about global climate politics is one of the aims of the book. In terms of post-colonial politics, I draw on authors like Fahana Sultana or Achille Mbembe, the Cameroonian philosopher, who draws attention to the way in which the legacy global politics is constituted through both the unplaying of the legacies of colonialism and contestations of those colonial legacies, and the hierarchies and binaries and forms of othering that constitute global politics more generally, but certainly global climate politics, and the long afterlives of colonialism and imperialism are at the center of their analysis. And post-colonial theory was really useful for me writing this book, in part because, of course, as a perspective on world politics, post-colonial theory emerges from a study of literature and fiction and cultural texts. So someone like Edward Said, I mean, that's his approach to studying forms of Orientalism, and also the way in which the empire writes back, if you like. And so that those traditions of literary analysis and bringing that into politics, political science, international relations, however we call it, I think that was that's been one of the really useful aspects of post-colonial theory for me. In terms of feminist theory, alluded earlier to a really interesting set of debates about whether science fiction or fictional text can be thought of as theory. And here I was really influenced by the work of people like Donna Haraway or Patricia Meltzer, who've really shown how theoretical speculative fiction can be forms of theory building, of world making in themselves. Donna Haraway famously says it matters what stories make worlds, what worlds make stories. I think it's really important, really interesting and challenging to see fiction as a form of theoretical writing, whilst also recognizing this isn't always how authors of fiction themselves see and define their role. And I think there are differences between theoretical texts written for understanding and explaining academic audiences and the work of fiction. And I think it is probably helpful to have that awareness of authorial intention and audience in these different genres. And then thirdly, in terms of queer theory or queer perspectives, here, this was a body of literature I knew less well, and actually came to it because of one of the things I was observing in the stories, which was that so many of these stories featured really prominent gay or queer characters or LGBT romance subplots and themes. And I was wondering about the connection between this and climate politics, and through that came into a body of literature on queer theory, which there's such interesting reflections from people like Rahul Rao or Nicole Seymour or Jose Esteban Munez about the role of the literature and the utopian imagination in politics, and the degree to which it presupposes or reproduces a certain heteronormative, racially gendered inscribed norm, and the ability of trying to articulate an ecological politics from the perspective of queer theory, which has often been quite suspicious of appeals to nature or the natural order in its kind of theoretical orientation. And so I found really useful some of the insights of queer theory in terms of thinking about how certain forms of political agency and resistance are about trying to unsettle taken for granted assumptions about what constitutes nature, ethics, family, relationality, those sorts of things.
You employ the concept of ecopolitical imaginaries. I think for many people that might be not 100% clear what you mean. So let's explain this more deeply, and also why Africa and why ecopolitical imaginaries. What's the connection?
Okay. So the concept of the imaginary has been around for quite a while in political and social theory, although I think there's been something of a turn or a return to the imaginary and the imagination in the last sort of 10 to 15 years or so. So the concept of the imaginary refers to socially shared and to some degree institutionally supported worldviews. So this is about the way in which people, communities, and societies think about themselves, their past, present, and future, their relationships with each others. And so for kind of classic theorists, I mean, Benedict Anderson is one of the most famous, but Charles Taylor or Cornelis Castoriadis talked about how the society is not possible without some shared institutionalized worldviews, understandings of forms of legitimacy or shared identities and values. Other theorists working on imaginaries emphasize more the kind of the constant interrelationship and interpenetration and contradiction and overlapping of multiple imaginaries within society, are kind of conflicting against each other. And this takes us into the way in which these terms have been quite important within critical theory and radical politics, because there is a kind of idea or assumption that by challenging dominant imaginaries, challenging the common sense, status quo, hegemonic, if you like, ways of seeing the world, this is one of the components of changing the way things work. That material and concrete political change is necessary, but revolutions also require upon shifts in worldviews and shared understandings of the world as well. I think there's an interesting and slight tension between the way in which the relationship between the imaginary and the imagination. So the imagination is at least in my work, how I would distinguish between the two. The imagination is sometimes reduced to more of an individual capacity, the power of an individual to conceive of things that don't exist immediately around them, that conjure mental images of something that's not immediately in front of you. And this can be quite easily invoked or appropriated from all sorts of different theoretical perspectives, and is I mean, technocratic bourgeois entrepreneurial capitalism is also very keen on fostering the imagination, the creativity of the entrepreneur, and so on. Whereas the imaginary refers to socially shared and to some degree institutionally supported. In my case, visions of the future and visions of relations with non-human nature or more than human nature. So this is the ecopolitical dimension of the imaginary.
We must employ a critical perspective on climate books on Africa, because sometimes I have books and it's like climate change in Africa. It's relying on one, maybe three examples, particular case studies, sometimes even not at the same era, like from the past, from the present. Some cases are even unfinished. And many students, many junior researchers asking how we should address this gap between writing about Africa and using particular cases. So when we put this critical lens on your book, what would be your answer? And maybe you can also recommend how to read your book. Is it a book which we should read from the beginning to the end, or we might pick a particular chapter and get some knowledge of it?
I love that question. Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, it's one of the central questions, as I was saying at the start, that we wrestle with. I'm wrestling with at the moment with students on a course. I teach a third year undergraduate course on Africa and global politics, which one of the central questions we wrestle with is it possible, desirable to talk about Africa in general terms, or should we just be looking at a smaller range of cases? And it's worth reiterating this at every opportunity, that Africa is not a country, and there's huge diversity and a range of political, social, linguistic, religious relationships with societies and the environment. However, as we also mentioned earlier, there is this also political assertion of African solidarity and forms of commonality in terms of experiences of slave trade and colonialism, in terms of experiences of European partition, in terms of the insertion of Africa into global political economies, in terms of periphery status and the kind of the racial and philosophical structures of global politics. And so my kind of take on this in the book was to draw upon, or in some ways artificially bring together a group of authors that I think can be usefully described as animating an African futurist political stance and project. And this isn't my term. This is Nnedi Okorafor's term. She distinguishes African futurism from Afrofuturism, which she says is more rooted in African American experiences, whereas African futurism is, she says, constitutes stories written by African authors in the traditions of African literature and rooted in African communities and cultural traditions. And so, I mean, it is an explicitly a political provocation that or an engagement with a particular political a project and philosophical aim to assert that these stories have some in their commonalities, that they articulate forms of African communal identity, relationship with ecologies that are transcend the boundaries of nation states and even differences between languages and colonial histories and so on. I really like the question about how to read the book because it was something I ended up thinking about quite a lot during the writing of it, in that a lot of my material was I was reading and thinking about fictional stories in different forms. So, I mean, let's just confine it to short stories and novels, which are different forms and have different structures, but they're certainly often read in a different way to academic texts. I mean, you would never turn to a novel and be like, well, I'll just read the introduction and conclusion to get a sense of what was going to happen. Whereas we do, all of us at times, read academic books like this. And I especially thought of this when I was writing the conclusion to my book. And typically an academic book sort of restates the argument and summarizes what's gone before and maybe is written with half an idea that some people will be reading the introduction and conclusion, whereas of course that's a very different style of writing to a fictional book. And thinking about these questions of form and writerly agency and the interpretation of the reader was something that I ended up reflecting on quite a bit during the writing of the book. And certainly, interestingly, in a lot of the fictional texts, perhaps unsurprisingly for writers, many of these stories conceptualize the act of writing as a political intervention. I think that's part of the African futurist political movement, that writing is a form of reclaiming and re-narrating histories. It was also many of the heroines of these stories were heroines who rewrote their own past, present, and future through forms of writing and storytelling in the stories themselves. And I think certainly how I conceive my own limited agency is in terms of writing and teaching, and this is deeply shaped by my own positionality and my own state as an author. I'm very mindful of the fact that I'm a white European male academic working in English at a British university, and the question of who am I to write this book, and the risk of writing a book that ends up reinforcing some of the hierarchies and exclusions and binaries and marginalizations that we know characterize global academia is something that's I was trying to reflect very carefully on throughout. But the ability to use our writing to challenge some of these in exclusions and hierarchies as well, and direct attention towards authors and intellectuals and ideas and movements that are marginalized within the mainstream is an important political act in itself, I think.
We might see the book as a climate governance, energy transition, and similar topics, but when we turn the page, it's not an easy topic to write about. Therefore, what was the most difficult when you were writing the chapters regarding not access to information or sort of academic level of books or quality of materials, but something that you were thinking about and you consider that might be important to share with future writers about similar topics, maybe some researchers. It might be something insightful you would like to share.
Yeah, it's a project that I took 8 years from start to completion. So there's lots of highs and lows along the way. I mean, there's two that each part was had its own challenges in different ways. There's two that jump to mind. I mean, firstly, I think that question that maybe is a kind of implicit in some of the questions you've asked as well, of why turn to fiction? Is this really serious and necessary and legitimate in the context of a climate crisis, and within a discipline like politics or political science or international relations? How serious and legitimate is it to turn to fictional texts? And are these not just diversions or forms of escapism from the difficulties of real world politics? I found engaging with the literature that had wrestled with those questions really energizing and inspiring. But I think there is keeping those tensions, or the limitations of your methodological approach in mind throughout, was something that I really wrestled with throughout. I think it's worth saying, the argument of the book is not that we just need to read and write better climate stories in order to solve climate politics. I think reading climate fiction can really deepen and enhance our understanding of climate politics. I think writing is a form of political engagement, but it is absolutely not sufficient for the scale of the crisis that we're facing. I mean, the other one was I was reading literature that, even though it was in some respects aimed for a global audience and accessible to a global audience, I was reading literature that was engaging and coming from cultural traditions and cultural backgrounds that were not my own, and that there were often, I'm sure, still my attempts to read books closely and multiple times and engage with the secondary literature and interviews with the authors, and all of those things. I'm sure there are still many things about the cultural backgrounds and assumptions and context that I missed as a British reader, and in particular in the chapters on ecologies and temporalities, in terms of trying to engage with African philosophical traditions of thinking about society, ecology relations, and alternatives to linear temporalities. I mean, these are tricky and complex ideas that it's a challenge to get your head around in terms of the philosophical debates, and then draw the connection between those and stories which are sometimes quite baffling and fantastical as well.
I got 3 questions, which I would like to use not only this book, but also your writings. And I think when people go to your Google Scholar, they will see that you are a good writer, because not only the quantity, but also the citation and how other people use your work confirms that, as we say jokingly, you know something about the topic. So I got 3 questions, and the first one is, your work often emphasizes the importance of analyzing environmental governance beyond national and international institutions. And how is your connection to local political dynamics that shape climate and energy policies in African countries? How would you describe the importance of researching that element?
Thanks. Yeah, thank you for your kind comments as well. I think in some respects, my methodological orientation has always been to start from the local, although how we define the local can change quite a lot. And over the course of my career, local has sometimes meant particular environmental movements, sometimes it's meant municipalities, sometimes it's meant um, localized sites within national politics. I mean, let's be honest, sustainable development strategies or net zero strategies, these are not always at the center of national government policy making. Sometimes these are crafted by a particular ministry, which is not always the most powerful ministry within government. But yeah, I think and so in some sense, it can be interpreted as a question about the particular focus and boundaries of your cases and case studies in research and methodologies. But I think I'm also, and maybe this relates to that kind of orientation towards marginalized perspectives and forms of resistance, and drawing attention to some of the interesting differences and contradictions between different political sites. Just one example that springs to mind, maybe especially in the current context, recording this just before the start of the 2026 FIFA World Cup. I wrote a paper on the 2010 FIFA World Cup, Football World Cup, which was held in South Africa, and had a prominent environmental component, a green goals program, which was intended to mitigate some of the environmental costs of hosting the tournament, and also use the spectacle of the Football World Cup to catalyze and stimulate environmental behavior change as well. And what I found doing research on that project was so much of this was being interpreted and driven at a municipal level between different cities and between different host cities who were interpreting the challenges of environmental mitigation in different ways. And in South Africa, there's quite a lot of there is quite a lot of power and agency at a municipal level, and the different ways in which, for example, Cape Town, Durban, Johannesburg were interpreting this national and global event and program with different environmental challenges, different political contexts, sometimes different political parties in charge of local government. It's those rich local differences that I think are necessary to try to get a sense of the broader picture of what's going on as well.
Based on your research, how would you describe civil society organizations and grassroots movements? Because we know that NGOs and charities and all that sector in Europe, that's completely different picture than in many areas in the world. So when we put together energy transition and global climate governance and that segment, what would be your take on?
Well, I mean, one starting point here is to make the observation that environmentalism fundamentally is a social movement. It arises from movements, communities, organizations, civil society, if you want to use that term. That's where environmentalism comes from. That environmental governance, I think, in its broadest terms, is what has often been as a result of citizens and activists holding governments to account and trying to get them to govern and mitigate and adapt and take account for forms of environmental externality that have often been marginalized or missing or absent from the top-down political purview. So I think environmental organizations, activists, civil society groups are absolutely at the heart of environmental politics, and I think this is true in some respects everywhere in the world. It's true in Africa as well. Although the forms that civil society take might differ, and sometimes when we have an idea about this, the what we think an NGO should look like, or what a civil society organization should look like, then this might not correspond when we look at it at different policy contexts. But there are very strong and rich networks of Friends of the Earth organizations across Africa. There's Extinction Rebellion groups cropping up in lots of different African countries. There's been some very strong national Greenpeace groups across Africa. Kumi Naidoo, who's an anti-apartheid activist in South Africa, was the executive director of Greenpeace for 6 or 7 years, and is currently chair of the end fossil fuels fossil fuel non-proliferation. I can't remember the name of the organization. And then there are also, having said that, though, there is, and this was a quite an important point of learning and realization for me when I started doing work on environmental politics in South Africa, is there is still a perception that environmentalism is a middle-class, white, Western, European, North American concern, that this is about saving butterflies and hugging trees, and that this doesn't correspond to the daily challenges of local communities in many parts of Africa. However, once environmentalism, the environmental agenda is framed in terms of a safe, healthy, and clean environment to live and work in, and challenges of air and water pollution and transport and clean air and things like this, then all communities everywhere in the world are wrestling with environmental issues. And I think at the community level in across Africa, you see huge numbers of communities and organizations working on environmental politics. And that's, as I said, that's really where environmentalism draws its strength from and has the ability to change mainstream politics.
It's not your first year researching Africa, and therefore I can afford the following question. What's your opinion about African scholars being more enthusiastic about contributing with the original research based on the local resources? Because I know there are so many cooperations between Africa, Europe, America, Asia, China, Russia, all the countries. But when you see sort of local people contributing to research, what would be your opinion?
It's a really important question, because I think we know that global international academia is structured by hierarchies and huge inequalities in terms of resources and the amount of time and space available to researchers to write and contribute to academic debates versus pressures to not only teach but also write research reports for non-academic organizations and so on. I mean, my perspective on this is that there have been so many, even within the realms of climate politics or global environmental governance, there have been so many significant, original, rich, vital contributions by African scholars, whether based in African universities or in the diaspora writing elsewhere. I think sometimes the role, all I can say in terms of my own role and the role of other scholars working in international environmental politics, is the responsibility is on us to pay greater recognition and tribute to the work that's been done by African scholars and African research centers, and try to work to rectifying some of the inequalities and marginalizations that tend to happen within the very standardized, formulaic textbook accounts of what are considered the core debates and the core case studies. And African politics is far more than case studies of Rwanda and apartheid South Africa, which is often what it sometimes gets reduced to within overview courses on international relations.
The last question for today's interview. I'm sure that there are so many under-researched areas in climate change, energy transition in Africa. If you could pick up only one, which that would be and why?
It's difficult to only pick one. I think uh, I'm tempted to reel off a whole list of issues. I guess, I mean, it's sort of an obvious one in the current moment, and that it's something that all of us are wrestling with as teachers and writers and educators, which is the role of AI, artificial intelligence, and its links to environmental politics and climate politics in Africa. It's sometimes portrayed as one of the solutions to adapting and mitigating to climate change, greater efficiencies of resource use. I think many of us and many researchers in the field are very skeptical about this, not only in terms of the water and energy intensity of generative AI data centers and processors, but also in terms of some of the assumptions that are built into those arguments about ecological modernization and efficiency and so on. But I think I mean, I was lucky enough to spend time in Lagos in November and talking to colleagues there working on and with artificial intelligence. It's such an interesting juncture we're at the moment, in which for some scholars and researchers in the global south, this offers opportunities to be heard and to engage with global debates that were not there before. And yet we're also becoming more and more aware of the biases and omissions and algorithmic downsides of the models that AI is relying upon. And I think both in terms of the material politics of data centers and employment practices in Africa, as well as the ideational and intellectual questions of what it means to learn, teach, write, and research. I think this is going to be a fascinating area to do research on over the next few years.
Dr. Deh, many thanks for sharing your insights, sharing your research about Africa, climate change, energy transition with us. But most importantly, thank you for bringing innovative perspectives. Something new, something maybe unusual for political science and international relations. And therefore, I like this episode to contribute to spreading a word about this, because I think we need more angles, more perspectives. And this opens so many chapters when we research energy transition and global climate governments. Again, many thanks for being on the IR Thinker.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the discussion.